So it looks like we currently have almost 150 people on the call, and I just want to give a big welcome to everyone. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the president of the PATH International Board, Sue Becklenburg, to kick off our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion panel event. Sue?
Welcome, everybody. Again, welcome to the PATH International opening panel, our annual meeting, and the long-awaited awards ceremony. We have a really full agenda to present, so we'll go ahead and get started. First on our agenda this year is a panel discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This past year, the Board of Trustees made a decision to ensure that the policies, procedures, and practices of PATH International were completely consistent with our stated values, that our actions accurately reflect our commitment to inclusiveness. We first formed a racial diversity, equity, and inclusion working group with a diverse membership, including PATH International members of color and some who have not previously participated in a PATH International committee. A list of workgroup members is on your screen. It was important to us that previously unheard voices had a seat at the table. It soon became clear that in order to ensure DEI was an integral part of PATH International, it required direction and leadership from the Board of Trustees. And for the board to provide that direction and leadership, there was a need to individually and collectively understand the language of DEI and develop the vision, goals, and objectives to guide the organization. Last May, the entire Board of Trustees initially dedicated 3 consecutive days, a total of more than 15 hours on Zoom, to educating ourselves and to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion specifically in the context of what that means to PATH International and what we can do as a governance board to support, sustain, and lift up our association members. This was truly hard work as we asked and answered the hard questions. In addition, in order to better serve membership, the PATH International staff also dedicated a full day to training on this topic. The result of that and subsequent efforts has been the development of a diversity, equity, and inclusion vision for PATH International and 3 high-level goals to ensure we are working toward making that vision a daily reality. Those will both be shared with you later in the meeting. The board and staff are now working closely with the Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Work Group, using their knowledge, experience, input, and advice to finalize specific objectives and determine action steps to take us forward on this journey. But why? What can we expect to get out of all this effort? I can give you a couple of examples, and there are hundreds more. One example translates to better services for our participants. Even though we haven't collected a great deal of data on this subject, we are all aware that our centers and members serve a very diverse population of participants. However, less than 10% of our certified instructors at all levels identify themselves as non-white, and less than 7% as non-female. A Harvard Business Review study in 2013 found that when at least one member of a team has traits in common with the end user, the entire team better understands that user. A team with a member who shares a client's ethnicity is 152% likelier than another team to understand that client. Another example is about innovation and sustainability. One of the strengths of PATH International members, centers, staff, and board is our creativity and ability to adapt and innovate. We have proven that beyond a shadow of a doubt over the last 2 years. Yet center sustainability remains one of the issues that we find challenging. There is statistical evidence that diversity can have an impact on our ability to translate innovation into revenue. In 2018, the Boston Consulting Group surveyed more than 1,700 companies in 8 countries to compare the diversity across 6 dimensions: gender, age, nationality, career, background, and education, with the corresponding level of innovation and financial performance. They found a strong and statistically significant correlation between the diversity of management teams and overall innovation, which translated into revenue. Companies that reported above average diversity on their management teams also reported innovation revenue that was 19 percentage points higher than that of companies with below average leadership diversity. As you will hear later in the annual meeting, the Board of Trustees has adopted a vision statement for DEI, for PATH International. Part of that vision recognizes that there is an historical and current lack of diversity within the equine-assisted services industry. As a leader within EAS, it is important for PATH International to ensure that the underrepresented and marginalized community at all levels, that we make sincere efforts toward diversifying our membership and certified professionals and broaden the reach of EAS to those underrepresented and marginalized communities. We must make sure that there is equitable access for all, not only as participants in EAS, but also as members, certified professionals, and volunteers. Earlier this summer, I was asked why the board had undertaken this initiative, if PATH International had received complaints of discrimination. I can say that no, we have not. This is not about responding to complaints. This is about embarking on a journey that will take us forward into the future stronger as a whole. This is about making PATH International better. And now I'd like to introduce the facilitators for today's panel, our DEI workgroup members, Nicole Boyd and Dr. Hallie Sheedy. For the past 18 years, Nicole has worked in academia alongside tribal nations to advocate for Indigenous peoples at primarily white institutions, centering sovereignty and furthering shared goals through collaboration, advocacy, and inclusion. Most recently, Nicole has been named to the Native American Employment Plan Advisory Council for the state of Illinois and serves as the vice chair for the Illinois State Museum Society Board. She has also held many positions in the equine field, including stable hand, instructor, wrangler, advisor, assistant coach, and barn manager. Dr. Hallie Sheedy is a licensed professional counselor and PATH International certified therapeutic riding instructor and equine specialist in mental health and learning. She is the executive director of PATH International Member Center Steps with Horses, a program devoted to providing equine-assisted mental health services in Fort Worth, Texas. She has received doctoral level training in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and has taught both undergraduate and graduate level courses in diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of North Texas. Please welcome Nicole and Hallie.
Hi, Hallie. I think that you are currently muted.
Okay, there. Now I am unmuted. Nicole, would you like to start by stating the goals for this panel today?
Oh, wait, there we go. All right. Organizer had me muted. I was trying to get myself off. So thank you, Sue and Kathy, for those introductions. Welcome, everybody. We're excited about the panel that we have today. We do want to make sure that we have some goals in mind as we move forward. So we've established 3. We hope that you'll be able to identify key reasons for increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion, what you'll hear us refer to it as DEI, within PATH International centers, and the industry. We hope that you'll gain examples of individual actions on how to improve DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion within your circles. And that this panel will help to take away from any fear of addressing and engaging in DEI work. And then Hallie's gonna talk a little bit about some comfort zones and some other stuff to get us started.
Okay. All right. So to prepare ourselves before we start engaging in this discussion, and we do very much want this to be a discussion that, takes place among our panelists. Well, you'll hear them talking with each other, not only answering questions, but also responding to each other. But we want to include you, the membership, in this discussion as well. So please do send in questions and comments. And as we're able to integrate those into the panel, we will. And as Kathy said earlier, anything that we don't get to, we will respond to after the panel. So how do we prepare ourselves to have a discussion like this? The first step is understanding ourselves and understanding how we may interact with new information. For a lot of people attending, a lot of this will be new information, or maybe information that's presented in a different way. And so one of the first things to understand is, what is our comfort zone? And so you can imagine your comfort zone sort of like a circle. And in the middle, that's where you're comfortable. That's where you feel emotionally safe. That's where you have information that you're already comfortable with. You're knowledgeable about different topics and activities that, like I said, you may be familiar with or just particularly skilled with. And so when we're inside our comfort zone, even though that's where we're comfortable, that's not necessarily where we're going to be challenged or we'll be learning new information. So the new information starts at the edge of that circle. So that would be what we call our learning edge, as we start to get towards information that's new or maybe confusing or surprising or things like that. And when we're at the edge of our comfort zone, that learning edge, that's really our best place to be able to expand our understanding, to be able to gain new perspectives, to increase our awareness. And our internal reactions, and I'll get to some examples of those in just a second here, are cues that we have reached a learning edge. And so we may experience different feelings such as annoyance, anger, anxiety, surprise, confusion, or even defensiveness. Those can all be signs that we're at a learning edge, that this is new information and we're trying to figure out how to process it, how to integrate it. And what we want to do is we want to be open to this new information. We want to be able to acknowledge our response to it, and be authentic in doing that, but also acknowledge that we're having a response. And so if we respond instead by withdrawing or retreating or avoiding from a discussion that we feel confused or surprised or uncomfortable with, and we dismiss information that doesn't fit with our way of seeing the world, we miss out on the opportunity to be able to expand that understanding. And so sometimes when we're confronted with new information, it can provoke a trigger response. And it's not that there are bad responses and good responses, they're just responses. And any response we have gives us information about how we're reacting to something, how we're taking something in. And so something that an individual says or an organization does that makes certain members of social groups feel diminished or feel offended, threatened, stereotyped can be a trigger response. And we can also feel triggered or threatened on behalf of somebody else as well. And so these are emotional responses. They can be hurt, confusion, anger, any of those sorts of things. And so there are helpful responses such as strategizing, leaning in, thinking, okay, I want to know more about this. I'm going to, really focus my attention here. But then there are some unhealthy or unproductive trigger responses, such as leaving a situation or avoiding a situation. Silence is a very normal response, and that can be good if it's, you're focused, you're taking it in, you're needing time to process, but it can also be an unhealthy response as well. Discussing is a very healthy response, but also along with discussing, there can be misinterpretation. So the key to all of this is to be monitoring how you're feeling through the course of a discussion whenever you're learning new information, and trying to stay engaged, stay aware, and stay open. And so as we go through this today, here are some personal questions to think about as you're listening to our panelists talk, and even as you're thinking about putting out your own questions or comments. What responses are most typical for you when you're confronted with new information? Are there differences in how you respond to a certain type of trigger, depending on what the topic is? What responses would you like to add to your personal repertoire? And which responses do you use most often now and you would like to stop using or use more selectively? And so again, just tuning into yourself throughout the course of the discussion and doing those check-ins with yourself. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole now.
Thanks, Hallie. So we want to make sure that we are also equipped with understanding some of the language that you might hear. Some of these terms might be new to folks. So we want to first talk about diversity, right? And that's understanding that each individual is unique and acknowledging our individual differences. And the ones that we typically think of first, or that come to mind first: race, ethnicity, gender, social class, sexual orientation, religion or spirituality, disability or ability, but others that we don't often think about: personality, educational background, appearance, socioeconomical status, income, parental status, marital status, employed, unemployed, employment field that we're in. This is obviously not an exhaustive list. I could go on, but it begins to help us recognize what makes us diverse and assists us when we're looking at who's represented in a particular group and who's bringing what to the table. So are we being as inclusive as possible? To engage in DEI work, we also need to define inequality, equality, equity, and justice. I think the best explanation that I've seen for understanding these concepts is thinking more about it as tools and opportunity, right? So inequity is unequal access to opportunity. Equality is evenly distributing tools. Equity is customizing those tools to identify and address inequality. And justice is fixing the system to offer equal access to both those tools and the opportunity. So that's a lot. What does that look like in practice, right? So we're all in the equine field. Let's think about a paddock, and we have minis and Clydesdales and a 100-gallon water trough. Inequality is putting that trough on the outside of the paddock where only the Clydesdales can reach over the fence and drink. Equality would be moving that trough to the inside of the paddock. When full, some of the minis might be able to get some of the water off the top, but once it's drank down, they won't be able to access that water at all. Equality would be building a ramp for the minis to access the trough as it's drank down, but they still wouldn't be able to access that whole trough, right? So justice would be getting rid of that trough completely and realizing that that system of watering isn't working, and it's inherently stacked against some of the herd, and replacing it with a system that provides equal access to both the tools and the opportunity, right? So such as hanging water buckets at varying heights so that each horse can access water that matches their individual needs, right? So that justice is what we're trying to get at when we talk about social justice. Kent State, I think, has a great model, and it's the 5 pillars of social justice, and that's equity, access, participation, diversity, and human rights. They define social justice as human rights that are centered around improving the lives of historically marginalized or historically looted peoples or groups of folks based on race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, and disability. At the end of the day, again, we're aiming for that social justice. And we have to define some of those concepts that we must understand to engage in DEI work, but there's one more I think that we really need to acknowledge and understand to achieve that social justice. And for some folks, this is often where that learning edge, right, that comfort edge really starts to kick in, and it requires a lot of that self-awareness. And it's when we talk about systemic oppression and racism. I want you to take a deep breath with me. What is the first thing that came to mind when you heard me say systemic oppression and racism? Did you think, I'm glad we're naming it? Did you think, that's not me, I'm not racist? Did you think, what did she just say? I've never even heard of these terms. Or did you think one of the millions of other things that someone could have thought based on your individual lived experience? That is the edge where, to understand, we must first take the individual out of the conversation and understand what system we're talking about when we say systemic oppression. It's historically rooted. It's a system that's based in colonization, and it intentionally disadvantages targeted groups by a dominant group, and it manifests in economical, political, social, cultural structures. This historically rooted system is still in place today. It's what most of our governments are based off of. The systemic oppression causes intergenerational trauma and trauma responses. So when we reintroduce the individual, when we reintroduce ourselves after understanding that this is a systemic issue, we have to be very mindful of ourselves when engaging in that conversation? And where is that learning edge? Why is it touching us in a certain place? Why is that an uncomfortable area for us, right? But we also have to be mindful of the lived experiences of the other folks in the conversation or at that table. We also need to understand micro and macro aggressions and how they play a role or could be a hurdle to DEI work. So microaggressions are real or perceived, everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental, insults, snubs that communicate negative or hostile messages to marginalized folks. Microaggressions occur on an individual level, so it's person to person. When we talk about macroaggressions, we're talking about acts of racism towards an entire group of people. They occur at a structural level with the intent to exclude by either action or omission, and often inform our acts of microaggression consciously or unconsciously. So how do we then dive even deeper into that unconscious and think about how do we make it conscious? How are we aware of ourselves in a situation when we're engaging in DEI conversations? And I think that there's 5 basic skills for diversity consciousness. You can look up Brooks and Cole. They have a great book on this. And it's the awareness and acceptance of differences, self-awareness, dynamics of differences, seeking to understand individual cultures, and adaptation of skills. That was a lot of information in a very short amount of time, but some things to keep in mind. So as we hear these acronyms or as we hear certain words, that we're thinking about it in those contexts, those definitions, then we're adding that individual layer. What is our lived experience and how are we coming at this work? How are we engaging? How are we bringing ourselves to the table? And then thinking about the lived experiences in today's discussion of the panelists, right? What has their experience been and what are they bringing to the table? It's going to help us really understand and engage. So again, know it's a lot of information to take in and digest, but we just wanted to provide some context before we dive into the conversation to ensure that you all have the tools in your toolbox to better engage in DEI. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Hallie to introduce our panelists for today.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Nicole, for giving everybody a quick rundown on some of the most important concepts and terminology. And I did want to speak to that terminology in particular, and just to put it out there, that language is abstract and it's constantly evolving and it's complex. And so there may be terms, as Nicole said, that you've heard before. There may be terms that you've not heard, or you may have heard some of these concepts described using different terms. And so even amongst our panelists, you may hear them using different language when they're talking about things, and you may even hear them have differences of opinion amongst each other in different perspectives. And that's part of what we're hoping to create today through this discussion. Okay, so to introduce our panelists, we have Dr. Veronica Lack, who is a LPC and the founder and executive director of the Herd Institute, offering training in equine facilitated psychotherapy and learning. She is also a PATH certified therapeutic riding instructor, equine specialist in mental health and learning, and serves on the governance committee and the racial diversity, equity, and inclusion work group for PATH International. Veronica works with organizations to increase diversity and accessibility across the equine industry. Veronica Williams is a PATH International certified therapeutic riding instructor in training and a member of PATH International's Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Work Group. She received her bachelor's degree in exercise physiology from the University of Lynchburg. While receiving her degree, she was secretary of the Black Student Association and founded an organization called Woman to Woman with the purpose of creating an inclusive and safe space for women of color. Michael Kaufman has worked in the human-animal interaction field for over 35 years with various organizations, including PATH International. Raised in Switzerland in a German Jewish family that fled Nazi Germany, he immigrated to the United States with his family when he was 14 years old. Michael lives in Connecticut with his husband and has a strong interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, both personally and professionally. Barbara Rector has 48 years learning wellness work with equines, including work with burros, techniques of elementary cavalry style lessons at the Cleveland Armory, successful 3-day competitions, dressage, and instructing traditional therapeutic riding and researching the physiological health benefits of being with horses. Barbara has trained as a spiritual psychologist and practiced as a psychotherapist. She has taught wellness with horses all over the world and developed the equine facilitated learning and psychotherapy program at Sierra Tucson Hospitals in 1990. Barbara is also the 2018 recipient of the James Brady Award, has served 2 terms as trustee of NARA, which is now PATH International, and 2 terms on the medical committee. Barbara is the matriarch to a multicultural family. Her 3 granddaughters were born in Munster, Germany. Like their mother, they speak several different languages effectively. Her step-grandson shares paternal grandparents who lived in Cleveland and continue to hold green cards from Germany. Okay. So Nicole, I will turn it back to you.
Yep. So oftentimes these conversations with groups start with a group agreement. They could be along the lines of, I will agree to turn off all my electronics. Don't do that today. We need you on this call. I will ask permission before offering feedback. I'll take care of myself in the conversation. I'll use I statements. The one that I like is I will trust intent, but I'll name impact. So Barbara has a great Adventures in Awareness Safety Agreement that we wanted her to share today. But just giving you also some tools while we're engaging in this conversation that you can take back to your circles. So it's always good to start with a group agreement. But Barbara, would love to have you share your Adventures in Awareness Safety Agreement.
As I am not of this age, I remember the first time I was issued a computer at work at a horse farm, and I was afraid to turn it on. And I feel like that now with this entire year of learning the DEI. It's been amazing. And I am completely at the, I'm in that place right now. You asked us to take responsibility for our thoughts, feelings, actions, behaviors, which I love. That was the heart of the safety agreement. It's quite easy to find online, and I'm sorry I was offline struggling to get back. But in the interest of time, I will tell you that being aware, awake, and conscious has been a tremendous learning curve for me, and I'm loving it. I'm just loving PATH for being so brave and so out there on the edge, meeting me really in my edge-dwelling world to help me learn further how early on, and I thought I was going to be a pilot of all things. I think in many ways I am a pilot, but my uncle refused to teach me any further, and he said, "Barbara, you don't want to land." And I have learned that true, and it's okay. So in your goals for what I hope we learned in this discussion is to open our hearts and our minds, our spirits, our souls, and hear new information that you all have put together in that remarkable teaching with your colleague to help us really decode. And thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts.
Thank you. So Michael just popped off. I don't know if he's gonna log back on. But for the three of you that shared, and I really want to, a lot of the work in higher ed that I've had and with tribal nations, one of the first things that we hear is reaching back to the community, right? Giving back and wanting to make sure that others don't have to experience what we're experiencing in those situations. And I think a lot of folks of color, BIPOC, folks of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, come to the work in that way. So Veronica, your experiences, I've heard a lot in other circles as well. And Barbara, folks being open to these difficult conversations, and being willing to engage and learn. And I think owning that we don't know what we don't know, and that we're going to stumble along this process. These are difficult conversations. Like I said before, they're historically rooted. And so how do we shift something that is so foundational of what we've been taught and our culture, in at least the US, and I would argue any other colonial state. So Michael, we are back. Can you share why DEI is important to you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, I don't know if you guys noticed in my introduction that I chose not to ramble down the organizations I've worked for and what I've done and which committee I've been on and all that. And I chose to kind of go the personal route around who I am or who I believe myself to be. And I think every one of us who listens to this, all 180 or however many we are, we have an inner self and an outer self. And the outer self is how the world sees us and judges us and perceives us. And the inner world is who we are and where we came from and all of that. And all my life, I've always been really interested in trying to bridge the two and make the two really fit together. And that has not always been easy, coming from another country, being raised in another language. You get a lot of reactions from people, some positive, some not so great. And you need to figure out how you can live and how you can be who you are and live out your own dreams in life. And I think that's what I think ultimately is at stake. And that's why it's always been really important to me that we try to recognize each other as people, who we are with everything and where we come from and what made us who we are. And yeah.
So Michael, your focus on your personal experience is a perfect segue into our next question. Oftentimes this work can be very challenging, although it can be very rewarding, of course, as well. And those challenges and rewards can look different for different people. And so given all of our panelists' varied lived experiences, we're hoping that you can share with our membership what has been your personal approach to engaging with this work and inviting others into this work, and what challenges and successes might you like to share? I can call on someone, or if somebody wants to start with that question. Barbara.
Well, truthfully, I'm the newbie in the group on even the terminology. I'm ashamed of my old thinking on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's a personal shame of ignorance. And one of the reasons I also have so enjoyed the learning curve. It's not easy. It's hard as heck. And at the same time, it has expanded my awareness. It has truly developed and enhanced the consciousness with which I go about. And it speaks to my soul on the enormity of its significance for our entire, I'm going to say, universe right now. It's that important. I was at a very exclusive private school just weeks ago, and I asked them, had they heard, and I was honored to meet the headmistress. She's new. She was really enthusiastic and thought, oh good, these kids are gonna, this'll thrive. And my son went to this school decades ago. And I asked her, she said, so what do you do? And I said, well, right now I'm spending some time learning about about diversity, equity, inclusion. I had never really known those terms. In one of the books that, because they were talking about reading lists for how they were going to address this topic, going from the board to the staff to the kids. And I said, well, first of all, could I suggest you start with everyone? Don't diversify or exclude anyone. It's so important. And these young minds are so hungry for learning. I wouldn't even dumb it down. I would simply, because again, you never know who you're talking to. You never know who or what their vast experience has been. And I would share with you that taking personal responsibility of what you're capable of seeing and absorbing right now is critical. It's just critical. And probably my favorite, I love people to share favorite books, but I would suggest this Waking Up White, because I woke up last year on one of our panels for PATH Learning, and I was like, holy, 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 I have selective blindness out of ignorance. I had no clue. And now here's what I love about PATH. Everybody goes, well, wonderful. What a great new learning. Sort of like, oh, you really hold your reins like this, not this. And we're all different on how we were reared or what our life experience has been. But my prayer is that those of us who find ourselves lifelong learners, and those of us who feel we have some more to, my belief system is, I'll own this part, that nothing comes into our realm by accident. It's here purposefully by what I call the divine source. And that must be included. And so I want us all to quit dumbing down what you think somebody can absorb and be what the horse demands. Horses demand our integrity. Horses and large animals and any animal really. And here's the other prayer. Please, please, could we all remember we human are animal. We are animal. We're not separate from the dolphin or the whale. And I had known Michael for decades on a committee in Denver, but I fell in love the day he told me he was struggling to find a ride east for his new position for the family cow. I was like, cows are so sacred, and you have a family member that you're struggling. Well, I can help you get a ride. We have trucks going all the time. And I love you, Michael.
Barbara, I think,
Wonderful learning from you. And Hallie, my teacher, Veronica, my teacher. And this is what I love about you, Veronica. Both Veronicas, I'm going to include you both in this, is you tell the unvarnished truth, exactly where you are. So I can implicitly trust you.
Barbara, I think when you were speaking to how you're coming to this information and these topics from relatively new, having lived a very long and fruitful and prosperous career up until this point, that connected with some of the membership. And we were wondering if you could speak more to some of the gaps you see between generations or the impact of being, different generations.
It's huge. It's huge, Hallie. I'll tell you right now, there are all, and I think it was Hallie who was speaking to the micro and mini. Could we become conscious of our language and drop aggressive terms? And because it's going to have to start with us. And what I learned was I decided, okay, I'm not going to join politics right now. It is our life. And, but they keep using the fight language. We must drop that. We just must drop that. Because in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was. And we must become conscious and aware of the origins of what our soul is demanding. I am not even included in it. My age is such, it is not included in the boomers, the newbies, the names. Do you know what our name is? The lost generation. I think that speaks to what we're all up against. And the next would be the beginning of us learning how the privilege of our being here, this particular lifetime, at this particular time, is a conscious design. How did that happen? And what are we mandated? And again, I go back to PATH because I have met some of my best teachers, and they weren't all 4-footed. They have been my new colleagues. And how do we get those together? So thank you, Hallie, for the question, or whoever asked it. Let's start with our personal responsibility, awareness, thoughts, language, our focus. What is the first thing you learn when you're going to be in the workforce? Do we have soft eyes or focused eyes? And here's the remark. We're not the only animal that can do this. We've discovered that. But we are one of the animals who has the capacity to choose. And that capacity for choice of going forward mindfully, consciously, with awareness. That's why we're here.
I think that's a beautiful analogy, Barbara, and very, very fitting. And I'm going to ask Dr. Veronica Lack to jump in here and share some of her thoughts and experiences.
Thanks, Ali. Barbara, I just want to respond to you. What warms my heart in listening to what you say is the degree of humility that you're inviting people to step into this conversation with. That's what I hear, in how you've described your own journey, is to understand that we don't know, everything that there is to know about what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. And when we step into this arena in talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it really does take a lot of humility to sit back and kind of say, I want to be available to listen to the other person's experience and not jump in with our own agenda or opinions or, ideas right off the bat. And I think that's, for me, seeing how you have broadened your perspective over the last year, particularly, like you said. I remember that moment in the virtual summit when we ran the Diversifying the Herd virtual summit, that there was this light bulb that went off for you, that where you kind of went, oh, I've never considered that perspective before. And so I think for me, when in answer to the question of kind of how do we approach this work, it's really important to hold that knowledge that we don't know what it's like for the other person, and to step into this with some humility. And just because I am a person of color doesn't mean that I understand what Veronica Williams' experience as a Black woman in the States is like. I come from the UK, you know, issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion are very different. And, you know, in this adopted country, you know, that I'm in now, it shows up within myself. You know, Michael was talking about the inner, you know, the inner version of ourselves and the outer version. It shows up very differently in both of those aspects. But there was one thing that you said, Barbara, that I kind of wanted to circle back to, is when you said, when you're encouraging people to lose the fighting language, that for me, you know, I'm thinking about Nicole's wonderful analogy of the Clydesdales and the Minis. You know, if the Minis didn't fight for their need for water, what would happen to them? If the Minis didn't fight and make it known that they couldn't reach it, what would happen? And so for people who are fighting and who are using that language, maybe that's necessary too. And it's part of the dialogue, it's part of the process. But it's not necessarily about the language of fighting that needs to be addressed. It's about listening to why they need to fight in the first place.
Thank you, Veronica. And, you know, that fits with the question, as well as, you know, what has been your personal approach to engaging others with this work, and, you know, where have you encountered challenges and what rewards have you experienced?
I think also kind of adding to what Veronica said, because I feel like me and Veronica sometimes read each other's minds, but creating the space to have the conversation. We all are alike in the ways of the same goal, but we all have different experiences bringing to the table. So also sitting at the table and bringing different thoughts and thought-provoking ideas kind of helps to basically start the conversation of diversity just by having different points of views when you're sitting and having small conversation or on a panel like this. So I would think that making you feel like you're alike, even in different spaces, I find specifically where I work is the easiest way for me to segue into talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It makes you feel comfortable enough to share your differences, because sometimes our differences people kind of stray away from. So I think that in this capacity, this is perfect in the exact way I would approach doing stuff like this. Also, because we have those differences and because of our personal experience, past experiences, it may also have us shy away from sharing personal things. But having conversation just in general creates that edge of education / discomfort. But feeling like you're with someone alike may just push you over the edge to say, oh, this is okay. So that's, and through to basically talking about it through conversation, and not like formal conversation, but just, hey, I did this weekend, or maybe just talking about something that happened over a course or in a lesson or something like that. You find segues into other things. So conversation is really big for me here, because that's usually how it starts.
Yeah. We did have a question comment come in, but I want to go to Michael first, and then I'll come back, because this question comment I think will take us a little deeper on what we're already talking about.
Thank you, Hallie. I wanted to throw something out to the panel, obviously, but really everyone. You know, DEI is sort of the current term, but what really stands out for me, we stand on the shoulder of generations. Civil rights in this country has been going on for decades and decades, and many folks who no longer are here have spent their life fighting for it. There are Native people, tribal councils who have been fighting for generations for their right, for their, you know, what is due them. There are feminists, women who have, you know, really put themselves on the line to get equal treatment, and of course, you know, LGBTQ as well. And, you know, the words are important, and we need to keep updated with the words, but the word queer was a curse word up until relatively recently. And if someone had referred to me as queer, I would have not been very happy. And I now have to adjust that a new generation is readopting that term into something very positive, and that's how they identify. And so what you asked Barbara about the generational thing is very important. And I think we're very lucky and very fortunate to be in this time, because I think we're ready to take it to a deeper level. It's no longer just about, getting the right to vote or getting the right to show up at the table. Now we're going to go to the next level.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this comment, that question that came in is sort of a two-part one, but the member is acknowledging in thinking about DEI work, the balance between engaging in meaningful work and not tokenizing or burdening our BIPOC colleagues with the emotional labor of this work. And so this individual was wondering if Veronica might be able to speak a little bit more about some of the challenges or obstacles that you've faced when working with well-meaning peers and colleagues, and how allies can show up better for our community.
Would you like to go first, Veronica, or would you mind? So,
go ahead.
So what's really interesting about this, and I'm going to be very transparent, me and Veronica kind of actually took a step back because we weren't quite sure how we would feel about taking on this panel in general, because sometimes when you start talking about those experiences that you're having, it can be slightly a trigger and kind of take you back. And sometimes you get kind of lost in that. So granted, we were excited, but also hesitant at the same time, because sharing our experiences, some of them can be heavy. So in that respect, I would say I'm excited, and I'm going to kind of share a little bit, but if I do seem a little reserved, please don't take offense to that, because I have to be careful and mindful of myself and my mental health and what this may have on me after I leave here or after going about my day and things like that. And you may see me seem a little emotional because sometimes stepping into that does kind of get that way. But as a whole, just nothing is quite new to me, because I did go to a predominantly white college and I've been in those spaces quite often. So the space itself isn't new to me, but the people that I'm around are a lot more new. So I'm also still reserved in that way, but still willing to share my experiences. So I used to tell the work group that I was like a newborn baby into the horse world, because I'm learning a lot more as the more I work with the horses here at Brick Hill, and just being in this work group, I've learned a lot. But in certain respects, I am what's the word I want to look for? Scared, because I don't know what comes beyond me. I can only see what's here. And sometimes that can be scary, because I don't know how people will perceive me as a Black woman in a very white space all the time. So for me, my experiences, how should I say, are a little heavy. So I'm not quite sure if I want to quite share them just yet. But I will say, being on this work group, I have become more open to sharing amongst small spaces that with similar people alike. So Veronica, I really appreciate you being here with me, because you are like my safety net right now. I appreciate that. But yeah.
Right back at you. I think that's part of the question. I really appreciate the question from this member, because, it can be scary stepping out to talk about, experiences being discriminated against, or, challenging the status quo and what that might look like and how that might be received. And for me, I think some of the most surprising challenges have come from the most well-meaning colleagues. And in some ways, you know, it's not a surprise to me that I have made this a central focus in my work, because, you know, I know Michael and I, we've spoken about kind of my tendency to be a bit more of a rebel and someone that challenges the status quo anyway. And so I kind of take on that role quite often in different settings. But I think the reason that I do that is because I see where injustices happen, and that's what fires me up, and that's what makes me fight for more equal access for others. And the types of challenges that I've come across have actually been of a personal nature, is people saying to me, you know, as I started to center diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of the Heard Institute, you know, offerings, that I was quite often told to back down on the language that I was using, or to not get too political in what I was saying, because it might turn people away. And my response to that is, well, okay, I'm willing to accept that, because if it means that the people that I want to reach, if it means that I can expand accessibility to people who haven't traditionally been able to step into this space, then that's okay, because that is my aim. So I think there's the well-meaning comments, you know, were coming from people who were wanting to protect me, knowing that I'd spent so much energy and time creating an organization that means so much to me. And they were worried that I might inadvertently, you know, put that in jeopardy somehow. But actually what's happened is, by centering diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, we ran an internal review a month or so ago, and looked at our student demographics within the Heard Institute, comparing it from 2 years ago to what we have now. So 2 years ago was basically when I started to really kind of center diversity, equity, and inclusion in what we put out in our marketing, in the way that we designed our enrollment process and all of that. And comparing the figures of student enrollment, we've gone from 9% Black, Indigenous, and people of color and or openly LGBTQ student population to 25% in the space of 2 years. So that real significant increase matters. That you know, that by centering these issues, by talking about it, like Veronica, you were just saying, by having those conversations, means that we are reaching people who traditionally haven't been acknowledged in this field. And it's not just about reach, you know, it's not just about outreach, but it's about highlighting organizations and people who are already doing the work that the mainstream of our industry haven't been aware of. And I think, you know, kind of the challenges in doing that means that sometimes it's exhausting, and it can be very emotional, and it can be very scary. But I truly believe that it takes all of us to be brave, to step out in this way, in order for change to happen. So for me, I would say 90%, maybe 95% of the time, it's really worth it.
I think some other words in that question that I think will help also take us to a deeper understanding is this idea of allyship, right? But I want to go back to something that both Veronicas kind of touched on. There is an inherent risk for folks, for BIPOC folks, to step out and push against those edges, right? I think about the stereotype of an angry Black woman. It's oftentimes when women speak up, are they intimidating, or are you intimidated by what they are bringing to the table, right? And that's a difference. That's that self-awareness. And that's that looking at stereotypes and understanding where they historically have come from. And are we playing into that? How do we disrupt that? And that disruption, for me, is right where that allyship and what I refer to as an accomplice come in, right? Oftentimes we'll say, I don't actually want an ally. I need an accomplice. We are doing work here. I don't need somebody just to talk to make me feel better about, yeah, I'll push up against those edges, keep doing the hard work. Like, I need somebody in the trenches with me, dismantling the system and rebuilding it so that it can be accessible for folks. And it is a risk that I'm not sure, and I don't know if anybody else can really describe it on this panel. I invite you to, until you are of that community, I'm not sure that you understand the risk that is taken. I have been pushed out of jobs. I have been told to, play the politics. I've been told, I always go back to that phrase, like, well-behaved women they don't make history, right? So how are we collectively disrupting and building that accompliceship and not necessarily allyship? And the last thing I want to say is do not put that work on the source community that you're trying to work with, right? There is a need for you to do your own work and then walk that fine line of including them when you go to make decisions, when you go to, just because you think you have a great idea for a community that's not accessing your center does not mean that community needs or wants to access your center, no matter how great the program is, right? And that's where you have to invite that community in to say, here's what we have. We're wondering if you're interested. How can we work together if that's something that you all would like? So, Veronica Locke.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up another terminology that we didn't touch on yet is intersectionality, right? Each of us on this panel, we represent a minority of some kind. And I think when it comes to, I love the use of the terminology of accomplice, because I do want somebody to be alongside me getting into good trouble, right? And I think that's where Michael and I, where we've connected is in that intersectionality. And I kind of wanted to bring that in because I know that you have a lot to say about that.
Absolutely. And both Veronica Lack, when you used the word brave a little while ago, that was the exact word entering my mind as you were saying it. And I just really want to make sure, that the membership is, understands that this is not easy work. And it does take a lot of bravery and a lot of courage to be able to have these discussions. And for people of historically underrepresented and marginalized groups to be able to speak up, especially when the system's in place. And I know system sounds like a big obscure word, and there's probably a number of you out there wondering, well, what does that even mean? But that, the stereotypes are part of the system that has made it difficult and silenced these groups. And so bravery, courage, those are all important things to be aware of when people of marginalized and underrepresented groups do choose to share their experiences, and even the process of their experience, which is one of the things that Veronica Williams was sharing with everyone, was not necessarily her specific experiences, but her process of even considering what to share and how to share it. So Michael and Barbara, we haven't heard from you all in a little bit, so I just wanted to throw it back to you to see if there's anything you would like to add at this point.
Well, the only thing that comes to my mind, and Barbara, I want to make sure you get into, is having been around NARA PATH for over 30 years, being male has always put me into a real minority in the rooms, on committees, often being the only male, only white male. And, I have had to really figure out how to function in an environment that is mostly female, and I have done so very happily and very well. But then layering in all the other me's, that's been more challenging. Being a gay male in the 80s, in the 90s was very different. And PATH NARA membership comes from many parts of the country and has many backgrounds and belief systems. And there always was the realization that some of the people in the room probably would not be for me or against me on some of the things that I am. It's not a woe is me thing. I have felt very welcomed. I have felt I could carve out my role in PATH and NARA and play a role, and found many friends and many colleagues. But there's a price to pay. And it's only recently that I started to think about what that price might be. Times when I didn't really speak up authentically, and I sort of spoke up the way I thought people wanted to hear me, or where I wasn't brave enough, maybe where I should have been. And then over time, I got more confident, more brave, and I think that's important. We have a great organization, and of course we're talking the centers and their target groups that they work with, their clients. Then we're talking about PATH, our organization, and the committee structure, the board, and DEI is so relevant in each of those. And I'm just really happy where PATH is now. But we have work to do. And, the one thing I also recognize in myself is the learner piece and also the bias piece. I just am so aware, even though I am supportive of DEI and I really have thought a great deal about it, my own deeply held biases are just scary. And they're there, and it's something to recognize.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so we are getting a lot of questions coming in that we're just not going to be able to answer today or to go to. But what that does tell us, those of us that are on the work group, is this is where we can go next. This is the information that the members are asking for. So even if we don't get to your questions, just know that we are seeing them, and we appreciate you sending them in. And so because we are getting close to the end of our time, and we wanted this discussion to flow organically, so we didn't want to rush to make sure we covered every certain topic, but we would like to end, because these are some of the questions that we're starting to get in. So what do people do now? What can they do within their centers? How can they be good accomplices? So if everybody, if our panelists would just mind, giving a quick response on kind of what they think is most important that they'd like to let people walk away with that would be great. And whoever would like to start. Barbara.
I have a few thoughts on that in terms of, I've had so many experiences in my life where I go, I had no clue. And that would be the beginning. And then as you go into your life, I'm going to make a presumption most people brush their teeth every day. Could I suggest that as you're brushing your teeth, you're looking in the mirror and you consciously put new glasses on or new ways of seeing? After a long time made you wear these blinder things that helped you see the way the horses see. And it's quite remarkable because it's not the same as the human sees. Well, in this topic of privilege, because every one of us tuned into PATH are privileged. Recognize that. Recognize the gift of putting these new glasses on and consciously for a day, look about, hear, see, be, in that open frame of, well, I had no idea. I had no idea. I appreciated, Michael, when you said, and my unconscious biases, my unconscious way of perceiving. Prayerfully set that aside for 24/7 and expand your awareness. Enlarge your consciousness. And perhaps, because it is my belief, I will own this, we are here purposefully. We are here to accomplish a purpose. And we might begin with learning for ourselves. What is my purpose here and now? And the answers will come at you at hyperspeed. If you can manage a whole day, congratulations. I haven't done it yet, but.
Thank you,
I
Barbara.
think that's a great point, Barbara. Thinking about that conscious versus unconscious, and how do we become more self-aware. But Michael and Veronica, do you all want to add something as we close out?
This is Gracie, my very scared dog. There's a thunderstorm happening right now, and she insists on sitting on me. So this is what's happening, in case you're wondering. For me, I think the action points, that's kind of what I'm hearing as people are asking, what can I do now? Is to look around your organization, look around your team, look around your personal life. How much diversity is there in your life right now? And if there isn't much, ask the question, why? How come? What can change? What can we do differently? Because if we aren't even aware of what's happening around us, then, nothing is going to change. So what is it that you want to see happen? What is it that you want to do differently? And if you don't know the answers of how to do it, there's plenty of information available. Hallie and Nicole's presentation, for a start, the fact that you guys are all on this call is a good starting point. So all of these actions mean something. And, every action leads to a reaction of some kind and some change. And so it's small steps, but every step counts. And I really want to encourage everybody to just keep going and keep asking the questions.
So I hear a lot of cultivated self-assessment, not only for ourselves, but also for our centers. And along with that, you can add the education piece. So you're asking the questions. Let's see if you can find the answers for yourself, and then see how that, see what you all come up with. If you have weekly staff meetings and there's like a question that's come up, well, why are we not, changing the language on our paperwork? Instead of saying parents, maybe say guardians instead, or why is it that we're not doing this? So see how, and maybe even visit other centers that may be doing things that you want to do. That may be something that I would think would be helpful, along with the self-assessment. And after you ask yourself those questions, well, what can I do? Visiting other centers, contacting your resources, and again, edu and .gov, like in the presentation said, would be perfect ways to answer some of those questions after you've done the self-evaluation of not only yourself, but the centers that you currently work at. And you never know, you all may be thinking the same thing, you just haven't talked about it yet. So conversation, education, and self-assessment will really help you out.
So,
Michael, do you want to round us out?
I'll try. What I'm just so aware of is that PATH International is changing. The horse industry is changing, and our world is changing. So it's really practical. Where are your volunteers going to come from tomorrow as the baby boomers pass on and Gen X even is getting old? Where are your donors going to come from? Never mind your participants and your instructors. And as there are fewer barns for little kids to be barn rats in, how do we bring young people to horses? And who are those young people? And we have to actively go out and create sort of a path into working with horses to help people, which is ultimately what we're about. And one way to do that is to enlarge our vision, to see all the people that are out there who should be in here and can be in here and who want to be in here. And as long as we are satisfied, and Susan, our president, started us off, did we start DEI because of complaint? No, we started DEI because this is what it's about. We need to make sure that what we do and what's so wonderful in what we do is going to be around for a really long time.
So I'm just going to jump in. Thank you, Michael. With one last thing, because we've actually gotten several comments coming from members who are in that place of they're wanting to have these discussions. They may be members of marginalized or underrepresented groups, and they're wanting to be able to share their personal experiences. And so being in a place where you are preparing yourself to be ready to have these discussions, whether it be with other staff, whether it be with your participants, doing that work, because, again, seeing the comments that are coming in, there are people in our membership that want to be able to start sharing with you.
Thank you, Hallie. Thank you, Veronica, Michael, and of course, Barbara, for sharing today and being open and leaning into this difficult conversation. Thank you, Hallie, for co-moderating with me. This work, again, is difficult, it's hard, it's heavy. But if we lean into it collectively, we can make a real change. And as Michael said, PATH is shifting and changing. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to work with the working group and work with PATH organizations. That question of what next, Kathy's going to talk a little bit about what's next for PATH. But what's next for you all, again, that individual work collectively. A huge component of shifting language, even slightly, can work over time to shift an entire culture. And definitely reach out. There's a lot of diversity consultants that can come in and do assessments and help folks out. And I'm excited to see the changes. But again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Hallie, for co-moderating. And I'm going to toss it over to Kathy to close us out for the day. And thank you, everybody, for attending, too.
Thank you so much, Nicole, Hallie, Veronica, Barbara, and Michael, for a really great discussion and for giving your time and sharing your insights and your thoughts. Veronica Williams, I really loved conversation, education, and self-assessment. Great words to live by, especially in the DEI space. I want to reiterate what Sue Becklenberg said at the beginning about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion for PATH International. As Sue said, this is about embarking on a journey that will take us forward into the future stronger as a whole. This is about making PATH International better. This journey of learning about DEI is also important to me, both as a CEO and as an individual. One of my mantras is we are stronger together. This has taken on new meaning for me as I continue to recognize the work that needs to be done to ensure together is for everyone. That together is a diverse group of people treated equitably who are not only invited to the meeting, but asked to speak and share their expertise. I am very grateful that the board has taken a strong leadership role, and also grateful for those who volunteered for the work group, who will continue to lend their expertise and perspective. The staff is ready to join the work group, taking the lead from the board's vision and goals, which you will all hear more about in the annual meeting, and taking those visions and goals and working with the work group to develop and implement action plans that take us to realizing that vision. Those are the next big steps. We know this work takes time, particularly as we commit to making this an ongoing and integral part of PATH International. So I say to all of you, best of luck on your journey, and please let us know how we can support you. Thank you for joining us for the opening panel. We will take a short break, and the annual meeting will begin again at 10:45 Mountain Time. Marcia is going to try to put up a poll. We'll see if it works this time. This is more of a fun question of, would you rather have 10 duck-sized horses or 1 horse-sized duck? Thank you all, and we will see you back in about 12 minutes.